Hello, everyone, and welcome to the NGM Network. Today, I want to talk to you about a war that many people in America and in the Western world do not know is happening right now. This war is the war in Amhara. Amhara, for those of you who don't know, is a province in Ethiopia. And in order to fully explain this war, we'll have to explain Ethiopia's recent history. Now, since 2020, Ethiopia has been in an on and off state of wars. From 2020 to 2022, Ethiopia fought the Tigray War, which saw as possibly as many as 500,000 people die to it. Now, it's important, before I even explain the war, it's important that I explain Ethiopia's leaders up to this point. Now, in 2018, Abiy Ahmed Ali came to power. He came into power due to the Ethiopian population being unhappy with the previous leader of Ethiopia. And the previous leader of Ethiopia was Haile Desalegn. I probably did not pronounce that right at all, but Haile Desalegn, or I'll just call him the previous leader of Ethiopia, was basically forced to resign in 2018 after massive protests against him. Now, the two largest ethnic groups of Ethiopia did not like him, and they both protested against him. And the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia is the Oromo ethnic group, and the second largest is the Amhara. And you'll see why the Amharas are very important to the story later in the video. But after Haile Desalegn was removed was when Abiy Ahmed came to power. Now, Abiy Ahmed promised reforms. He promised that he was going to change the country, and he'd made good on those promises initially. He even made peace with Eritrea, Ethiopia's neighbor that had been in an on and off conflict with for approximately 20 years. He earned the Nobel Peace Prize in 2019, and it seemed like things were going on the up and up for Ethiopia. That is, until the Tigray War began. Now, to understand the Tigray War, you have to go back further in Ethiopia's history. Now, Ethiopia had been ruled by a communist government after the monarchy was overthrown in 1974. This monarchy was centuries, if not millennia, years of this monarchy was not only centuries. How do I explain this? This monarchy had not only centuries of years leading experience leading Ethiopia, it had possibly millennia of experience leading Ethiopia. After 1974, the monarchy was overthrown and communists took over Ethiopia. Ethiopia was put into chaos, and it's important to note that in the 1970s and 80s, in early 90s, Ethiopia still controlled Eritrea as well. And that's important to the story as well, but I'll get into that a little bit later. Anyways, the new Ethiopian communist government that took over in 1974 would fight a brutal civil war against its civilians who rose up against the communists. And a lot happened during the civil war. And Somalia would take advantage of the Ethiopian government's distraction and invade a region in the southeast of this map in Ethiopia called the Ogaden. Now, that's an entirely different story, but to summarize the Ethiopian Civil War, it's basically the Ethiopian government just trying to put out all the fires it can as far as insurgencies, but with every insurgency they would stop, another one would begin. Now, the Soviet Union had supplied the communist Ethiopian government, but in 1991, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, so did the Ethiopian Communist Army, and the Ethiopian Communist government swilled a fight. The TPLF, located in northern Tigray, which is the red spot on this map, worked together with a group called the EPLF, the Eritrean People's... Oh, I should probably mention what the TPLF acronym is. The TPLF stands for the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. It was formed after the Ethiopian Communist government began clamping down on ethnic groups and trying to basically make the entire country, the entire populace, submit to them. So the TPLF began working with the group called the EPLF in Eritrea. Now, Eritrea had been a part of Italy since the late 1800s, I think. And Italy had wars with Ethiopia as well in the late 1800s and in the early 20th century. The Second Italo-Ethiopian War was the war which Italy had taken over most of Ethiopia. Now, there were groups in Ethiopia who still fought against Italy after Italy fully declared a victory over Ethiopia, and Italy never was able to control the entirety of Ethiopia after the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. There were resistance groups and insurgencies that the Italians couldn't fully take control over. And think of it as basically America and Afghanistan. America officially comes into Afghanistan in 2001, and America defeats the Taliban in 2001, or they think that they defeat them, but the Taliban just go into hiding and just start waging an insurgency. And that's exactly what happened in the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. Now, the Second Italo-Ethiopian War started in 1935. Officially, it ended in 1937. But if you research, there's something called the Winark, and I'm probably not pronouncing that right, but just look up Ethiopian resistance to Italy from 1936 to 1941, and you'll probably find it. But I don't want to be here all day, and to fast forward a little bit, the Allies in World War II, after Italy would join World War II, they began helping the Ethiopian resistance, and Ethiopia would be fully liberated from Italian control. Fast forward to the end of World War II, and suddenly Italy will no longer be controlling Eritrea. Now, the West... Oh man, that's serious. I don't know if you can see this, guys, but there's a kidnapping alert. Hopefully that kid is okay. But explaining more of the history, you would have the West, which would be the US and UK, debating on what should happen to Eritrea. Should it be an independent country, or should it be a part of Ethiopia? Now, Haile Selassie, the leader of Ethiopia at this time, wanted Eritrea to be integrated into Ethiopia. And the West wasn't fully sure of whether this should happen or not, but when the Soviet Union started supporting the idea of Eritrean independence, the West, aka the USA and UK, started to be more comfortable with the idea of Ethiopia controlling Eritrea. Now, initially, Eritrea was supposed to have its own parliament and its own laws and rights, but gradually over the decades, Ethiopia chipped away at that, and by the time of the Communist Revolution, Eritrea had basically been fully incorporated into Ethiopia. Now, why is all of that important? Well, it's important because in this period after Ethiopia had fully integrated them into Ethiopia, which was in the late 60s and early 70s, they began to rise up a group that fought against the Ethiopians, which was called the EPLF. The EPLF wanted independence from Ethiopia, and so, knowing this, they worked together with the TPLF, especially after the communist government took control of all of Ethiopia. So, that was a lot to explain, but it explains the history of the TPLF and EPLF. Now, going back to more recent history, you have the TPLF overthrowing the Ethiopian government, working together with the EPLF in 1991, and the TPLF begins to rewrite the constitution of Ethiopia and even decides to let Eritrea go as an independent country. This was unpopular with some in Ethiopia at this time, but the TPLF did not want to take control of Ethiopia just to have to deal with an insurgency in Eritrea. And they decided to let Eritrea go, even if it possibly meant losing their sea access. Now, Eritrea and Ethiopia initially had a good relationship after the communist government fell in 1991, but that slowly degraded into a war, and Ethiopia and Eritrea had a frosty relationship for 20 years. But it's important I explain how the TPLF governed Ethiopia domestically. The TPLF would create a party called the EPRDF, the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front, and they would change the regions of Ethiopia. Instead of being more focused, instead of the communist government, which had regions split due to geography or due to political leanings, the TPLF decided to split regions due to ethnic differences. And this is called ethnic federalism, which has been criticized by many living in Ethiopia today, and many Ethiopian citizens say that this has led to violence. Now, the TPLF would basically rule Ethiopia almost like a dictatorship, not as bad as the communists, but democracy was heavily restricted. There would be two leaders before before basically this guy, I'm not going to try to pronounce his name. There'd be one leader before Haile Selassie. Now, the leader I'm talking about, I don't have his picture, but the leader that led before this guy was called Miles Zenawi. Miles Zenawi led Ethiopia from 1993 to 2015. And he's the one that created this ethnic federalism. Now, Miles Zenawi would die in 2015, and since he hadn't picked a successor yet, that led the EPRDF choosing this guy to be the new leader of Ethiopia. The problem was Haile Selassie wasn't ethnically Tigrayan, and there were some in the TPLF who wanted Tigrayans to have to be the leaders of Ethiopia. And it's important to note that the Tigrayan population in Ethiopia is only 5% of all of Ethiopia. Again, only 5%. But the TPLF were able to control the rest of the 95% of the Ethiopian population because they were the ones who defeated the communists in 1991. Well, the situation would not last long. And from 2015 to 2018, this guy would lead Ethiopia, but in 2018, there would be mass protests against him, and the Oromo and Amhara, two of the biggest ethnic groups in Ethiopia, would begin to almost revolt against him. This leads to the introduction of Fano. Now, what is Fano exactly? Fano, F-A-N-O, is a group that was an Amharic militia, and they based themselves off of the Ethiopian resistance fighters who led insurgencies against the Italians in the Second Italo-Ethiopian War. They think of themselves as sort of a resistance to government overreach, a resistance to tyranny or, dictatorships, and they see themselves as the protector of the Amhara people. Now, Fano was formed in the early 2010s, and this was when the TPLF and EPRDF still led the Ethiopian government. Now, Fano would have minor clashes with the Ethiopian government here and there in the early 2010s and mid-2010s, but it didn't really take off until 2018, which is when Fano, together with the Oromo population of Ethiopia, helped to topple the leader, Haile Selassie, and this would lead to Abiy Ahmed Ali getting into office. Now, it's important to note that this temporary alliance of convenience between the Oromo ethnicity and Amhara ethnicity did not last. But for the time being, it still would last due to the Tigray War. If this is all confusing and complicated, it kind of is. And Ethiopia's current political state and its history is very complicated. And I suggest you do research for yourself as well, because there's a lot that I can't even fit into this video. But to simplify, Fano was one of the parties responsible for overthrowing the old TPLF and EPRDF regime. Now, after Abiy Ahmed took power, you had, the initial reforms, as I said earlier, the initial changes to Ethiopia, and it looked like Ethiopia was going to change for the better. That is until 2022. Now, 2022 was the year that COVID hit the entire world. And it is in mid-2022 that Abiy Ahmed Ali declares he's going to delay the Ethiopian elections until 2021. Well, the TPLF, they don't like that idea. They think Abiy Ahmed Ali is trying to grab all the power for himself. And they declare they're going to hold elections regardless of what the federal Ethiopian government does. So, in December of 2020, I don't remember if it's in December, but I know in late 2020, they hold their own elections in their own region of Tigray, and they win. Now, this would lead to more tensions with the Ethiopian federal government, and many people started to get concerned that a war would break out, and a war finally would break out on November 4th of 2020, when the TPLF did a preemptive attack on Ethiopian bases in Tigray, and they even managed to capture some Ethiopian generals. The Ethiopian government was caught off guard, and since they were high-ranking generals who technically were supposed to be loyal to Ethiopia, but were also members of the TPLF, the Ethiopian government lost some of its commanders to the TPLF because they were more loyal to the Tigrayans and TPLF than the country of Ethiopia. Now, this would lead to the Tigray War, and I've already explained, I'm pretty sure, how this led to 500,000 people dying. Now, what's important to note is that Eritrea would get in this war on the Ethiopian side because Eritrea had its own problems with the TPLF, and the TPLF was the leaders of Ethiopia during the period when Ethiopia and Eritrea had frosty relations and on and off border conflicts and skirmishes, which was from 1998 to 2018. So, fast forward to the end of the war, and the Pretoria Agreement is signed. Now, many people have died at this point, and many people in Ethiopia just wanted the war to be over. Now, the only problem is the Ethiopian government and TPLF are the main parties that signed the peace agreement. Eritrea was not invited to the peace agreement, and neither was the group of Fano. Now, Eritrea accepted that they were invited, but Fano felt betrayed. It's important to note at this point that in 2020, from 2022, Fano had grown from more than just a simple movement for Amharic people. It had grown into a full-blown militia with its own leaders, its own advisors, and its own weaponry. So, Fano, feeling betrayed by the Ethiopian government, and the Amhara people feeling betrayed by the Ethiopian government, led to tension. And this is where Amhara is located. On the red spot of the map, it's right below Tigray, and it's a sizable chunk of Ethiopia. So, this distrust of the Ethiopian government would linger for months. That is, until April 7th of 2023, when the Ethiopian government, trying to unify the country after the Tigray War, would announce that they would be banning militias and they would be restricting private firearm ownership as well, which they basically would limit a person to owning only one firearm, and said person could only own one firearm and they couldn't give it to anyone. This enraged many Amharic civilians, and they decided that the Ethiopian government under Abiy Ahmed Ali was going too far. This is what leads the Fano militia to fully revolt against the Ethiopian government and the war in Amhara to start. Now, it's important to note that Fano, at the time and still today, has no single leader. They have two very important figureheads in the movement, but they still isn't a single leader of Fano. The first important leader of the Fano movement would be Escalate Niga. Now, Escalate had previous run-ins with the Ethiopian government before Abiy Ahmed Ali took over. He was declared a terrorist by the TPLF-led government in the mid-2000s to early 2010s, and he was jailed by the TPLF, but he later was released in 2018 when Abiy Ahmed Ali took power. Now, he got involved with the Fano movement when it was first initially forming in the early 2010s, and He's a key leader in it because he advocates for the rights of the Amhara, and he advocates currently for resistance against the Ethiopian government. Another key leader of Fano is someone called Zemene Kase, and I probably did not pronounce that right, but there's less information about him. However, we do know that he was a key leader of Fano during the Tigray War, and he leads a branch of Fano in a different sub-province of Amhara. Now, I want you guys to keep in mind that Amhara is actually probably bigger than you think, and Ethiopia as a whole is bigger than you think. Ethiopia is twice the size of France, so there's a lot of space in Amhara itself. So there's multiple commanders and multiple leaders, sub-leaders of Fano fighting against the Ethiopian government in this insurgency. It's hard to explain, it's hard to visualize because there is no front line. It's just members of Fano fighting against the Ethiopian government, then retreating back into the jungle, and the cycle just repeats itself. They'll attack a city, they'll take it over for a few hours, and then retreat back into the jungle. And with a war like this, it's hard to see any front lines because it's constantly just shifting. Now, it's important to note that the Ethiopian government has many advantages in this war against the Fano militia in Amhara. Now, the Ethiopian government has an elite unit called the Republican Guard, pictured here with the red berets. They are the special forces of Ethiopia. They endure intense training, and they protect the Prime Minister of Ethiopia himself. They are not to be underestimated, and they were very effective during the Tigray War. Ethiopia also has the advantage in the air and on the ground. Ethiopia has purchased Su-30 fighter jets from Russia, which are semi-modern fighter jets. The Su-30 was made in 1992, and Ethiopia also has the Su-25. It's either the Su-25 or the Su-35. I think it's the Su-25, but basically the Su-25 is a close air support flying vehicle similar to the A-10, and it will shred any sort of ground troops that are on the ground fighting against the Ethiopian army. Ethiopia also has countless Chinese, Iranian, and Turkish drones, which devastate Fano. And it's very hard to get away from a drone. And Ethiopia has been able to wipe out entire battalions of Fano by just following them with a drone, waiting for them to meet with the other Fano members, and just sending a missile towards them, which kills hundreds of Fano members. But the downside to using drones is that innocent civilians get killed in the crossfire as well, which lead to there being more Fano members because they're angry that their family has been killed in an airstrike, and this creates something called insurgent math, which, let's say you have 5 insurgents, you kill 2 of them, and now you would think you have 3 insurgents, right? Well, no. Now you have, let's say, 6 insurgents. For the 2 insurgents that you killed, one of them had a father, one of them had a brother, and one of them had an uncle. Now they're all going to fight against you for killing their family member. So where does Ethiopia go from here at this point? It's unclear what Ethiopia does at this point, because Ethiopia has been in a state of war in the region of Amhara for around 2 years now, since April 7th of 2023. This war has constantly been going in one direction and the other, with no clear victory in sight for now, and possibly in the near to late future as well. The Amharic militia and the Amharic people are able to resist the Ethiopian government's attempts to completely stop the insurgency. However, they have not been able to break out of Amhara and capture the Ethiopian capital of Addis Ababa, which is the ultimate goal. Zooming in on this, I can't zoom in, but on this map, you'll see west of the Amhara region, there is a small dot that is separate from the other borders. That small dot is Addis Ababa, the capital of Ethiopia. And it may seem like all the Fano militia has to do is just get out of Amhara and capture the capital located probably, 20 to 30 miles away from the Amharic border. But it's not that simple. In between Addis Ababa and the region of Amhara is Oromia. Oromia is the massive region which you see borders Amhara from the west to the east. And Oromia encircles all of Addis Ababa. Now, the Oromos, the largest ethnic group in Ethiopia, have been fighting their own insurgency against the Ethiopian federal government for decades. And although not as successful as other insurgencies in the region, they still have been causing pain for the Ethiopian government. Now, if Fano were to try to capture Addis Ababa, they would have to deal with the Oromo Liberation Army, which is the group responsible for those insurgencies. This would only cause the war to widen, and this would lead to more casualties, to more death and violence. At this point, it's unclear whether Fano even intends to capture the Ethiopian capital, even though it's one of their goals. It's likely that Fano intends to just wear the Ethiopian government down in Amhara until the Ethiopian government comes to the negotiation table and gives in to Fano's demands. Because although Fano can't beat the Ethiopian government on the ground or in a large-scale war, they can tie the Ethiopian government's forces, and they can make the Ethiopian government, while they negotiate, then keep fighting and wasting resources. So, it is likely that the Ethiopian government in the future, let's say 2 or 3 years, will just come to the negotiation table with Fano and the region of Amhara. They'll give in to some of their demands. They won't meet all of them, but they'll try to stop the fighting rather than to keep wasting resources in an insurgency that they won't be able to permanently stop. But that is just my analysis. Tell me what you think in the comments down below, and thank you for watching this video. Thank you for staying during all of this video, and I hope every one of you has a good day.